Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Song of Solomon.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I have a question for you. What to do with Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, as it's sometimes called? That's the book we're looking at today. This is an oddball. Well, at least at first glance, it's an oddball, because it just looks like it's a collection of poetry about romance and deep, passionate love, including physical attraction and physical intimacy. But when you look closer at it, you discover that you were right. It is exactly all of those things. So why would that be in the Bible, which is a story about God's redemptive plan? And I'm content to just let that tension, that question, hang out there until we've had a chance to look at the raw material of what we can say for sure is definitely going on the pages of this book, which again, sometimes is called Song of Solomon, sometimes it's called Song of Songs. The reason it's called Song of Solomon is the opening line, which is the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And of course, understandably, the most natural assumption when you look at that, and indeed this has been my assumption my whole life until my last few readings of this book, is that Solomon must have written this. And we're about to probably get some kind of love poetry or love song that is written from Solomon's perspective, that is expressive of him falling in love and meeting somebody. And as you read through it for the first time, you're like, well, yeah, that's what it looks like it is. There's a young lady in this story. There's a young man in this story. And we meet them after they're already past the point of discovering initial interest in each other. These two are really into each other. And it looks like they both live in some sort of pastoral environment where they both are involved in the keeping of sheep or flocks in some way, which means they go where their flocks go. And as the flocks wander, they are separated. And then they find themselves looking for each other and longing for each other. And they find themselves delighting when they find each other again. And it's like there's a cycle going on with each of these poems or songs within the Song of Solomon, where their passion and joy upon rediscovering each other at the end of a day or a week or a cycle of going out and grazing with the sheep and looking after them, where that joy bubbles to the surface and they just can't wait to see each other and express how they're feeling about it. Like, I don't know what your life was like when you were a kid and you had a crush, or maybe if you're married, when you were starting to deeply fall in love with that person. But I still have handwritten notes that I received from my wife, and they still make my heart race when I read them. We went to college together, but we lived in different states and we were separated for huge chunks of time. And during that time, I found myself missing her heart and her personality and her beauty, and thinking about who she was and what she looked like, and trying to capture those emotions of yearning in letters that I wrote back to her as well. I need to get back to where Solomon fits into all of this. But at the most basic level, you got a lady and you got a dude, and their work seems to take them apart from each other, and they can't stop thinking about each other. And when they get back together, these songs seem to represent them pouring out their heart. What the book doesn't give us is a crystal clear narrative, though. In the beginning, it looks like they're not married, and the scenes never quite take us to the place of the marital bed. Eventually, it looks like they do get married, and then it looks like that relationship is consummated at that point. Now, that may just be the arrangement of the poems, but that order of business would seem to be in keeping with the assumptions of the rest of the Bible about the ideal for marriage and physical intimacy for God's people. But to try to reduce this thing down to some sort of lesson about the right way to court someone and the right way to do marriage and how physical intimacy ought to be conducted, I think you can see that in other parts of the Bible, but I don't think that is strongly on display here. I think instead what we're getting is a profound celebration of this super important God-given part of the human experience. How can you have a wisdom section in a Bible that holds itself out as being from God if you don't address this deep water, powerful part of the human experience? But back to the Solomon thing. Every time I read it prior to the last few times, I've just assumed like, well, this is from Solomon's perspective. This must be when he met his wife, or, well, as we know from reading the book of 1 Kings, one of his many wives. But the last few times I've read it, I've come around to thinking that I don't believe this is written by Solomon or from Solomon's perspective. I think this is dedicated to Solomon somehow. I think Solomon and his reputation are being drawn upon as a poetic and literary setting. This is wisdom literature in the style of, in the flourishing wisdom literature era of Solomon. And then I think Solomon is introduced into the story in a few different moments to maybe even contrast this kingly understanding of love, maybe even love out of obligation, with the real, true discovery of love, the exclusive love that the young man and the young woman in this story represent. After Solomon gets mentioned in this opening line, we don't hear from him again until almost halfway through the document, when it looks like he shows up at the wedding. But what we get running up to that is a whole lot of screen time, like I've been talking about, between this young man and this young woman. And they're just saying what they think of each other and what they want to do with each other. And they're using similes and metaphors that I found very confusing and off-putting when I was a kid, because the things that they liken the other's physical attributes to, it's just hard for me to picture how that would be attractive. But somewhere along the way, books or school or whatever, smarter people have pointed out to me that this genre of poetry from this era didn't tend to draw on literal visual comparisons, but instead draws on something a little less obvious about whatever that comparative is, to praise the beauty or the attractiveness or strength of the other person. A great example of this happens in chapter 4 when he is talking about her teeth, and he likens them to a bunch of shorn ewes, like sheep. Teeth don't look like sheep, bro. But then you read a little further and you're like, oh, I get what he's talking about in an ancient world context, especially a context that was informed for these two by the fact that they worked around sheep. He says, your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them has lost its young. What he's saying is, you beautiful woman, you have all your teeth, and I find that very attractive. I'm sure having all your teeth was not a foregone conclusion at this point in history. And that kind of imagery repeats throughout all of these poems in ways that can be a little disorienting at first, but if you can get past the giggles and really stop and think about why they are drawing these likenesses for each other, then you start to get into the poetry and you start to really appreciate it and even feel connection with these lovers from maybe as much as 3,000 years before the time when you and I are reading it. Well, the various little scenes, the little vignettes that we get poetically presented throughout the whole book sort of hang together, but I think it's okay to mostly read them all independently and think of their love like the way you think of any kind of love. It's open-ended. You don't know where this thing is going. There's always more when you're truly in love with someone and when you're truly plumbing the depths of who that person is and who you are and what you have together. And I think the structure of the book just accentuates that all that much more. There's another scene at the end where Solomon shows up. And for me, this little tidbit within the last few verses at the end of the chapter helps really clarify and solidify what's going on here in terms of who is who and where Solomon fits. It looks like Solomon shows up and tries to buy the love of the woman we've been following all the way through this thing, which is kind of gross and mortifying, and it seems pretty tacky even in the way that it's presented. We might want to rush to the defense of Solomon, who's a Bible hero, and be like, he would never do that. But kinda. He did have like a gajillion wives and concubines, and that's again part of the reason I don't think that this can be a description of Solomon's love. One, because we know who his first wife was. It was an arranged marriage with the daughter of Pharaoh. Nobody was doing any shepherding there. And then after that, things spiral into kind of sexual, relational madness for Solomon. And this thing at the end seems to be more in keeping with that, as he shows up and offers some kind of wealth or influence in exchange for this young woman's love. Maybe the original audience is intended to think, oh, Solomon is trying to get her in the harem, but she stiff arms the king. She's like, no, thanks. My vineyard, my very own, is before me. You, O Solomon, may have 1,000 and the keepers of the fruit of 200. And then we just get a little bit more between her and the young man she loves, and that's it. So in that regard, I have to think the original audience would have read this as, at least in part, a contrast between the kind of love that was probably often celebrated at this time and romanticized, like, it's the king and this harem. And I mean, it's the most love of all the love. Look, he's got hundreds and hundreds of wives and concubines. That's more. More is better. But the contrast then would be like, is it though? Because look at what these two have. They might not have riches, they might not have all of this other stuff, but they have each other and they mean it, and there's no compulsion. Listen to the way they talk about this. This is the ideal of what love is really about. But that brings us back to that big glaring question I threw out a little bit earlier on. Why is this in the Bible? I think I'm content to say it's in the Bible because this is wisdom literature, and wisdom literature deals with the reality of the lived experience of being a human in this world as God's redemptive plan is playing out. And this is a huge part of it. And this is a book that's dedicated to it. Honestly, for me, that's enough. But the idealization of love here does hearken back to a time before everything got cheapened and wrecked by sin, a time that we looked at when we were going through the book of Genesis back at the very beginning. Could this be intended as a nod, a yearning to when relationships could be even deeper and more profound and unbroken and even more naked and honest before each other, even more lasting? Maybe that is present on these pages. Is it some sort of metaphor for the love between God and his chosen people? Or as Christians have often treated it, as a metaphor for the love between Christ and his church? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. It doesn't look like that overtly. I suppose anytime, though, you see imagery depicting beautiful, profound, unflinching, deep love that withstands difficult tests, that serves as a metaphor for the love between God and his people, the love of Christ for his church. So I suppose it's there. I just don't see anything that overtly points to that. And come on, if you've been going through the Bible with me, you know that I see things that are pointing to Jesus all over the place in the Old Testament. Here, I just don't think we have enough to say, like, oh yeah, that's the purpose of the whole book. And honestly, I think those interpretations over the centuries just came about because people were uncomfortable with the subject matter of the book, and they wanted to do something to make it a little less giggly and uncomfortable. We often lament the state of the world today and how bad things are, and I get it. I feel that sometimes too. But maybe one of the benefits of this odd little moment we live in is that we're better positioned to appreciate this for what it looks like it was intended originally to be, which at its core is a celebration of God's generous gift of love and physical intimacy. I know I am grateful for those gifts. When you visualize Song of Songs, picture a young, beautiful shepherdess and her young, handsome shepherd lover embracing near their flocks. When you think about the point, think about a celebration of love, attraction, and physical intimacy. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, find a way, because this one really needs to be read beginning to end to appreciate it, and it's a pretty quick read and a pretty profound read. And with that, double achievement unlocked, because we not only just finished Song of Solomon, but we also just completed the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament. And next time around, we're on to the prophets and the book of Isaiah. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.